Goodreads or StoryGraph? So recently, a lot of people have been moving from Goodreads over to this new website. It doesn't have an app yet, and it's called StoryGraph. And there's so many different reasons that people are giving for moving over from Goodreads to StoryGraph. And I made an account for StoryGraph way back a couple months ago when it was still in beta, and I wasn't really super impressed by it, and I just decided, you know, I'll have this account, and if the website ever ends up making it, then maybe I will move everything over to StoryGraph, and I won't use Goodreads anymore because, you know, Goodreads isn't the best website, it's not the best app, and I would much rather have a really good alternative to Goodreads, and hopefully StoryGraph will be that. So for the past month, I have been using StoryGraph, but I've also been using Goodreads kind of at the same time, and I wanted to see if I liked Goodreads better or if I liked StoryGraph better. And I feel like I've given both pretty good shots, and I have compiled a pros and cons list for both Goodreads and StoryGraph. So I'm going to go through the pros list of Goodreads first, and then we'll go through the cons, and then we'll go through the pros of StoryGraph, and then we'll go through the cons of StoryGraph. So the first pro for me is that I've been using it since high school, and it has all of my books on there. Like, I have every single book that I've ever wanted to read on there since probably 2012 or 2013. And recently I did make that video where I went through my TBR on Goodreads and kind of, you know, took out some books that I wasn't interested in anymore and tried to make it a bit more concise. But still, I have like hundreds of books on my TBR, and they're all on Goodreads. The next pro for Goodreads is that it's easy to interact with friends, and I have a lot of friends on Goodreads. So Goodreads has always been promoted as a social media app for book readers, and I do really like that aspect of Goodreads. I like that I'm able to see what my friends are reading. I like that I'm able to see where they're at on their challenges or where they're at in a certain book. I like to hear all of their thoughts about the books that they're reading, and I feel like Goodreads is really interactive in that way, and I appreciate that. I like having that sort of community setting for books that isn't like Twitter or Instagram or YouTube. The next pro is that it's easy to update along the way while reading. I really like to take advantage of that update tool where you're able to, like, say I'm on page 50 and this is how I feel about page 50, or this is how I feel up until page 50 or whatever. I really like using that. I find it to be really great when I'm going back and trying to remember how I felt about a book, or if I'm reading a series and the next book is coming out, I like to go back and look at my updates for that book and be like, okay, so this is, I remember this, I remember that. I don't really have to, you know, update myself or reread the book. I can just go look at how I felt on page 204 or whatever. And this also kind of ties into my last pro about having all of your friends on Goodreads. I like to see their updates as well and how they're feeling in the middle of the book rather than how they feel at the end. I mean, I like hearing that as well, but I feel like knowing how someone feels on page 100 is really helpful in trying to figure out if you're going to read the book or if you're not going to read the book. The next pro is that it's easy to keep track of my books and organize them. I have so many shelves on Goodreads, but I actually really appreciate that because I'm kind of able to be like, okay, so what were my favorites of 2017? Or what were my favorite books of 2018? Or what were the books that I wanted to DNF? I even have a shelf of books that have Taylor Swift lyrics as the title. Like, I have so many different shelves on Goodreads. It's really easy to organize, and I really like that I'm able to do that. The next pro is easy way to get recommendations. I've asked for recommendations a couple of times on Goodreads, and one of the most notable times was when I asked for recommendations that were similar to Stalking Jack the Ripper. And I got a bunch of different recommendations, and some of them were like Jacoby by William Ritter. I really love that series. I love that first book. I love, you know, all the books that I've read in that series. So good, and so much like Stalking Jack the Ripper. It was perfect. I've even gotten The Lady Rogue by Jen Bennett recommended to me for Stalking Jack the Ripper, and it was perfect, amazing, totally what I was looking for, and I ended up loving that book, one of my favorites of 2020. And my last pro for Goodreads is that it's easy to read reviews from friends and other reviewers. I use Goodreads mainly for A, the updates option, and B, reading reviews from friends and other reviewers. I find reviews to be so helpful when I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to buy a book, if I'm going to read a book, when I want to read a book, and especially like if I'm going around like Barnes & Noble or a bookstore. I love to have Goodreads open and like search for like the books that I find interesting, and I'll like scroll really quickly through my friends' reviews or, you know, just like the general population's reviews. And I find those so helpful when I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to, you know, spend my money on a book, especially if it's going to be full price. Like, I really need to know if my friends gave it more than 3 stars or if they totally hated it. And usually that helps me figure out if I'm also going to like a book, because I tend to be friends with people who have similar taste to me or whom I really aspire to their taste in reading. So if they like a book, then I will hopefully like a book, and so it's just super helpful that way. And I just love reading reviews. Like, I just find the act of reading reviews to be really enjoyable. So now on to the cons for Goodreads. I only have a couple of cons, surprisingly, but they are really big cons. So I feel like they're at sort of the same weight as the pros. So the first con is really, really obvious. It's owned by Amazon. And while I do use Amazon for some things, I really try not to use Amazon. I feel like it's kind of a nuanced discussion. However, I do feel like I wanted to put that in the cons because it's also a con for a lot of other people and a big reason why other people are moving over to StoryGraph. The next con is that it has horrible search capabilities. Like, literally, the search engine on Goodreads is so bad. And especially I've noticed recently that whenever I've searched for a book, like at least 9 times out of 10, it doesn't show up anywhere. Like, I'm like, I will search for the title, I'll search for the author, and I can't find it, and it's so frustrating. I hate the search engine on Goodreads with a passion. And the third and last con is the interface glitches a lot on both the app and the website. So like I said, these cons are like really big cons and definite deal breakers. I hate the way that Goodreads glitches. It's so confusing, it's so touchy. I feel like a lot of times it happens to be down and it's unusable, and it's just so frustrating to use Goodreads. And that's definitely one of the big reasons why I wanted to try out StoryGraph and see if it would work for me, because Goodreads is just such an awful app. It kind of reminds me of how bad Tumblr is. They're definitely on the same level for me of like enjoyability of using the app or using the website. They're both pretty garbage. Okay, so moving on to the pros for StoryGraph. Unfortunately, StoryGraph has less pros than it has cons. I feel like my feelings for StoryGraph are a little mixed, but hopefully seeing these pros and cons, you'll kind of understand where I'm coming from. So the first pro for StoryGraph is that it's a cool way of recommending books based on your interests. And I really love the way that StoryGraph recommends books to you, because on the homepage it will just have like some general recommendations, but also if you're looking for something specific like a dark romantic fantasy, you can put in those filters and it will show you books that are categorized as a dark romantic fantasy. So I really love that that is possible on StoryGraph. That is something that is not possible on Goodreads. I really appreciate that. The next pro for StoryGraph is that it breaks down your reading habits into pie charts. I love that. I also have like sort of a reading sheet graph thing, and I've been using that all of 2020. I definitely want to use it again in 2021. But that is something that I've done on my own. So for people who don't really want to spend the time doing that and, you know, figuring out Google Sheets or whatever they use, StoryGraph kind of just does that for you. And it has these really cool little like pie charts of like, you read this many fantasy books, this many contemporary, this many whatever. So cool. I'm going to show a little bit of an example over here, but it's just so awesome. A really great tool, and it really shows you what your reading habits and what your tastes are in a way that like is very easy to consume. The next pro for StoryGraph is that I enjoy the reviewing process, but this is kind of a two-parter, so I'll stick with like the pros of the reviewing process first. So the pros for the reviewing process are that it's really interesting in the way that you get to kind of categorize it as, was it fast-paced, was it slower-paced, medium, was it enlightening, was it emotional, was it sad, was it tense? And I think that those are really interesting ways in being able to review a book, and it also helps with being able to recommend those books to certain types of readers. I also really like that it just has like an empty space for the rating, so you can kind of do like a 3.5, you could do a 4.75 or whatever. It's not just like on Goodreads where you have to choose between 1 and 5 stars. So I think that that's a really interesting and cool reviewing process. So on to the cons. I'm going to go with the second half of the reviewing process. It doesn't encourage writing reviews, which I find to be really frustrating. I don't write like the longest reviews or anything, but like I said with Goodreads, I do like reading other people's reviews, and StoryGraph isn't really conducive to reading or writing reviews. It definitely focuses more on the categorization process instead of the actual reviewing process, which is a little frustrating to me. I don't love it. That's why that half is in the cons list. The next con for StoryGraph is that it doesn't have an app, which I find to be a little disappointing, but I totally understand. It's still a really new website, so it's not gonna have everything. You are able to make a shortcut on your home screen for the StoryGraph website, so it kind of makes it an app, but it's not really an app, which is a little disappointing. But like I said, it is still a really new website, so there is always time to make an app. I just have to put it in the cons list. The next con is that it's not visually interesting. Not that Goodreads is necessarily the most visually interesting app either, but I feel like it has a bit more visual complexity compared to StoryGraph, which is literally just black and white and has no actual like graphics or anything. It's a very, very stark and clinical sort of website. The next con is that it has a difficult interface. I find it really difficult to browse on StoryGraph. I find it difficult to kind of go through the different pages on StoryGraph. It's just not super user-friendly, which I find irritating. So it kind of has that same sort of interface of like Goodreads. Like Goodreads isn't really that great with like browsing either. So it's kind of hard to go through like each page of like trying to get to your account, trying to get to, you know, your friends list. I mean, I actually don't even know if you can get to your friends list. I've never been able to. So that's also another con that I have on this list. It doesn't encourage interactions with friends. You know, like I said, I've never been able to access a friends list, so I don't even know who my friends are on StoryGraph. I can't keep track of them. I can't really see them. There is a page to see updates from your friends, but it's not really in the way of Goodreads where it's like a social media app. It's definitely more of like a kind of organization tool. So I'm not too mad about that because it's not necessarily doing the same thing that Goodreads is doing. However, like I said with Goodreads, I do like to interact with my friends on Goodreads and I like to see what they're up to. And unfortunately on StoryGraph, you can't really do that. And the last con that I put on here is basically exactly what I just said. Can't keep track of friends. That's super frustrating to me. Like you can add friends on StoryGraph, but you can't see who they are after you've done it. You can't like, there's no list of friends. There's no like following and then follow, you know, that kind of thing. Really, really frustrating to me. So I've already talked about some of the books that Goodreads has recommended to me. I also want to talk about some of the books that StoryGraph has recommended to me. So recently I read 2 of the recommendations that StoryGraph gave to me. I honestly can't remember what I put into StoryGraph to get them to recommend these books to me, but I'm sure it was something like romantic fantasy. So the first one was Trick by Natalia Jaster. I gave that book 3 out of 5 stars. I felt pretty meh about it. It wasn't a great like first recommendation. And then I ended up reading The Bird and the Sword by Amy Harmon, and I gave that book a 4 out of 5 stars, and I really enjoyed that book a lot more than Trick. So Goodreads has given me somewhat better recommendations. However, I feel like StoryGraph has given me more interesting recommendations. So I don't know which one I prefer in that sense. I mean, I really like that Goodreads has given me 2 of like my all-time favorite books. And then StoryGraph has given me some recommendations from books that I'd never, ever heard of before. So I think that, you know, there's pros and cons for both of those, and I feel like those are actually pretty equal. So overall, I feel like I have pretty mixed emotions with both Goodreads and StoryGraph. I don't feel like one is necessarily better than the other. I think that they have very, very different purposes. And if you're looking for something that is more of a social media app where you get to interact with friends, Goodreads is perfect. And then if you're looking for something that is more based on figuring out what your tastes are, figuring out what your reading habits are, and finding new and interesting recommendations, I would definitely go with StoryGraph. For me, I feel like I'm going to continue to use them in tandem. I really, you know, have some pretty strong pros and cons for both of them, and I feel like they're very useful when used together. So for me, I'm gonna keep using them together. And if in the future StoryGraph ends up adding in these things that I feel like are missing or improves upon their website and maybe adds an app, I will definitely, you know, try to switch everything over to StoryGraph, because I do feel like this website has a lot of potential, but I don't see that happening for another few months, if not a year. So for now, I'm going to keep using Goodreads, going to keep using StoryGraph because I want to support it. And I feel like that's a really good compromise, and it works really well for what I'm looking for. So if you have a Goodreads or StoryGraph, let me know down below. Feel free to check the description where I have my Goodreads link and my StoryGraph link, and you can go ahead and follow me on both of those. And also let me know down below which one you prefer. If you like Goodreads better, if you like StoryGraph better, and why. I really want to know your reasons for liking or disliking either app. And I hope you all enjoyed this video. I didn't really want this to be a you should use Goodreads or you should use StoryGraph kind of video. I wanted to kind of show that there are both pros and cons for both of these, and that the pros and cons definitely vary per person. And I just wanted to show you guys what my pros and cons were going to be for both Goodreads and StoryGraph. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, and StoryGraph. All of those links will be down below. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!
Ooh, I thought it'd be me and you. Oh.